between eating, let's say, and gambling. What could they have in common? My own view is it's this. It's the thrill of the moment. Anyone eating, but we're all guilty of this, of course. We all know when we eat what the consequences are. But for some, it's harder to actually pay heed to the consequences, and one lives for the thrill of the moment, the sensation, the experience. Similarly, the thrill of gambling, the adrenaline, the thrill. I'm not a gambler myself, but my father is. The thrill of the wheel spinning, or the unfolding of the cards or playing a game of poker. Everyone knows when they gamble what the risks are, yet we still do it. So it's the thrill of the moment in certain cases that will actually trump the consequences. You might see now where this is going towards. And that is associated, it seems, with an underactive prefrontal cortex. Now, will there be more risk-taking in the future? Why should I say this? Well, we've seen that risk-taking is linked to an underfunction in this way, and that the prefrontal cortex itself is related to excessive reaction to external stimulation of the here and now. For example, schizophrenia and obesity. We know, or we saw when we were looking at the developing brain, that an emphasis was on sensation, and you didn't need so much networking. Think of the people who were blowing their mind, having the sensation all the time. Now, if the future screen technologies are indeed characterized as they are, not for everything, of course, but in many cases, certainly the things that young people like to do, by fast, strong sensory stimulation, given that brains adapt so faithfully, remember the taxi drivers and remember the piano players, could it be that in the future there will be more risk-taking because you have absolutely wired your brain into that sort of configuration? Now, let's think about that. And I mentioned I was going to talk about human nature. Is this, therefore, going to impact even more on our very humanity, on the kind of thoughts that we had at the very beginning? Human nature is a tricksy word because you disenfranchise the rest of the animal kingdom, and yet nature suggests that it's something that is ubiquitous in time and space, irrespective of whether you're an ancient Greek or 21st century London or whatever. You will do things that are recognizable, the same as the ancient Greeks, that chimpanzees don't do. To cut a long story short, what it might be, and this is suggested by someone called Stephen Mythen in a book, The Prehistory of the Mind, is that we appear more than other creatures to think symbolically. So, for example, if you take a chimp, however dexterous they are, and however sophisticated the social hierarchies in which they live, you never see a chimp with a symbol of tribal status around its neck. Chimps don't make themselves necklaces to show the boss chimp. Whereas humans, and even the Neanderthals, for a long time have been using symbols. One thing in terms of something else. One thing in terms of something else. Symbolism. And that, in turn, what does this mean to you? If I show you this, for some it might be naff, to others a status symbol. It means more than merely being an umbrella. Because that's like the M&S advert, doesn't it? This is not just an umbrella. Yeah, it's a symbol of different things. So we are all the time doing this in a way that other creatures are not. Now, what's very interesting is this does seem to relate to our frontal lobes. Look at our frontal lobes, even compared to chimps, yeah? Of the whole outer layer of the brain, the cortex occupies 33% in humans and only 17% in chimps. And also, what's very interesting, for those of you who are familiar with this notion of evolution being reflected in development, interestingly enough, this part of the brain comes on stream much later during development, only towards the end of teenage years is it fully operational, interestingly enough. So we could almost think of children as having an underactive prefrontal cortex, and indeed they take risks, live in the moment, and so on. So could it be that this notion of seeing one thing in terms of another is linked to the prefrontal cortex, and when it's not active, we get a different type of consciousness? On the one hand, one can imagine the strong feelings such as children have and non-human animals have, as opposed to a world where thinking dominates. A strongly sensory world as opposed to a cognitive one, where you see one thing in terms of something else. Where you live for the here and now, or where you live in the past and the present, or fantasy or the future, where you have a narrative rather than just a freeze frame. In one, the external environment is dominating, you are ricocheting off that and responding to that, as opposed to an inner world dominating. Another, therefore, that has little meaning. You don't see something, we said meaning was one thing in terms of other things. The thing is what you see is what you get. It's in and of itself by virtue of its sensory qualities, as opposed to one that has the personalized meaning that you're growing through your connections. One, therefore, where you don't have a strong sense of self, you are not self-conscious, but on the other hand, when the prefrontal cortex is kicking in, a strong sense of identity, a strong sense of narrative that gives you a consistency to go through life. Here, no time and space, we're just there in the moment. It's not strongly referenced. If this is another impairment with damage to the prefrontal cortex, is something called source amnesia, where you lack the time and space context, whereas here you have a clear time and space reference as to what you're doing. Infants and children, this would be the kind of world. Older children, adults, and here I'm suggesting this is prefrontal underfunction and this is prefrontal activation. So you're having these, and of course you can switch from one to the other depending on what you do to your conditions and depending on what environment you are in. And if you put yourself in an environment that is like this, then you are not encouraging, perhaps, your prefrontal cortex to be as active as it would. So if you're losing this kind of environment all the time, this World of Warcraft, of which you saw a clip just a while ago, I'm just wondering, and it is a suggestion, because of what we've seen, whether this is predisposing the brain to not make as much use of its prefrontal cortex as it would if you were living a three-dimensional life. So we would go possibly from a cognitive world back to a sensory one. And sometimes we like to do this, and that's fine. It's like eating chocolate. It's fine. But you don't want to eat chocolate every hour and eat nothing else. And are we perhaps thinking of a world where, in some cases, and I don't want to sound extreme, there is an over-dieting of the equivalent of chocolate. So this is another shameless plug for my more recent book, in hardback on the left, paperback just come out on the right, where this is articulated a bit more. So I'd like to end not only by, again, thanking Women of the Year for the chance to have this platform, but because it was suggested I would come up with some suggestions. These are the three. First, I am the first to put my hand up that this is not proven. There is no evidence that sustained experience playing computer games leads to an underfunctioned prefrontal cortex. On the other hand, there is circumstantial evidence that I think suggests that we should test it. I'm sure many of you are mums or parents, and wouldn't you like to know that? Wouldn't you like to know, rather than just dismissing it? And the experiments are relatively straightforward. They're brain scanning experiments where you take people in their 20s and ask for volunteers who play computers versus not. That's the first thing I'd like to see, is money put into research into proving or getting evidence for whether this is having the impact that it may be having or could be having. Second, another line of research is to explore what is so addictive, what is so attractive about playing these games. Why is it so special? Why do people choose to do that rather than choose to go out and have love affairs or walk in the rain or have a three-dimensional life? What is so special about this experience that one spends a lot of time and money doing it? If we knew that, perhaps we could offer those things in other ways. And third, contrary to the Luddite demeanor I'm supposed to have or might be giving the impression I have, I would very much like to sit down with IT people to say, okay, how could we give more a sense of metaphor? How could we give more a sense of narrative and of significance and of abstract concepts? Because if we can do that, we could harness the technologies to deliver the kind of society we want rather than sleepwalking into it and being at its mercy. And surely that's what science and technology has always been about, and it certainly was about that when Michael Faraday stood here and demonstrated the electric motor. Thank you very much. I haven't gone too long.